welcome to my fellow PR professionals in Malaysia and across the ASEAN region. I'm going to share my slides with you today. I'm just going to share the screen, thank you. And so I'm Mandy Pearse, I'm CIPR President 2021, and I'm going to be talking to you from the UK. And I'm delighted to join you at this Kuala Lumpur International Public Relations Conference. So I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about the future of corporate and sustainability reporting. So I'm going to talk about corporate reports, and I'm going to look at, where we've come from and where we are with corporate reporting. I'm going to recap some of the pressures and influences which are changing the way we do these corporate reports. I'm going to look at a few examples, and I've put links in my slide deck, which I'm sure will be available after the conference so that you can have a look at those too. And I'm going to pull out what I think are some interesting trends in those reports. And then I'm going to look at what I think the issues are for us as PR professionals. So for the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot around in the corporate and financial investment world, particularly about ESG, so environmental, social and governance reporting. And it's become quite a trend. It wasn't and isn't really that new, because there are organisations that have been doing this wider sort of corporate reporting beyond the usual financial report for quite some time. So there's plenty of learning that can be done from charitable and public bodies. So for instance, in 2018, the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, which I'm president of, had a go at creating an integrated report. Now, integrated reporting came out of the work done in South Africa following Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And it was very much a recognition that organisations and businesses needed to be more transparent and needed to think in broader terms than just the financial impact of their organisation. So it talked about different types of capital, financial capital, yes, but also social capital and environmental capital. So one of the things that we learned from doing an integrated report is that these are quite time-consuming reports to pull together, and you need to work really hard to bring together all the data and information in and present it in an accessible way that people can then really get a sense of what your organisation is about. So I'm going to look at if you wanted to have more interest in integrated reporting, that's managed by an organisation now called the Value Reporting Foundation, which has brought together the International Integrated Reporting Council and a standards body to look at giving a consistent and reliable framework of standards to report against if you take the integrated reporting route. So that's an area definitely to have a look at. I'm also going to think a little bit about why these types of broader reports have become particularly popular at the moment. So thinking about the ESG, the environmental, social and governance aspect, obviously we've had huge environmental influences over the last few years. So we've had the Paris Accord, where organisations across the world committed to being net zero carbon by 2050. And here in the UK, in November in Glasgow, we have the pleasure of hosting the COP26, which will be where some of the major developed countries come together to look at those commitments and the action that they're going to take. And hopefully we're going to see international leadership on perhaps bringing those targets forward slightly. But why has it become an issue for business? Well, it's because we're seeing the impact of more of climate change, of a more unstable climate. So in Europe, for instance, this year, we've seen flooding in the summer in Germany, and then some of the worst wildfires that we've had in Greece this summer. And obviously, we know that other countries around the world are also experiencing mass flooding in areas like Bangladesh, but also drought and fire in Australia and California. So we know that these are global impacts, and we all have a responsibility around them. Plastic pollution has been a particular high-level topic for a few years now, with Western countries standing accused of exporting their plastic to less developed countries and creating massive pollution headaches for those countries. So what we do in our supply chains as organizations, both on materials coming in and on what we do with the materials and packaging that we produce as the products go out, have also become topics for our reporting. We've also had a lot of social unrest over the last couple of years, possibly some of it linked to people feeling restricted through COVID-19 restrictions. But we saw mass protests around racism, particularly in the US following the death of George Floyd, but also we've seen them in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand and in other countries around the world. We've also seen women protesting in large numbers, women in India undertaking large protests around agricultural issues and around violence against women. We've seen those protests, particularly in the UK, around violence against women and the Me Too protest online. So we're seeing much more activism and a requirement for organisations to say where they stand on some of these social issues. We've seen huge debates raging backwards and forwards around COVID vaccines and the access to vaccines, and whether Western countries have been accused of stockpiling vaccines rather than making sure that every country in the world has access. So the issue of equity has been high on people's agenda. And there is still the ongoing issue that many corporations have outsourced their manufacture and production to countries where wages are lower and possibly working conditions are not as good. And that has allowed issues such as child slavery and people working in very inadequate circumstances. So again, that issue of equity, if it's not appropriate for our workers, say in the UK, why is it appropriate for anybody else's workers anywhere else around the world? So those sort of social issues have become really important for business to have a position on, not just governments and other organisations. But then the way that corporations are governed has also become really important. So we've seen, the financial near collapse of the banking industry in 2010 globally really rocked around governance of our financial institutions. How strong are they? How well maintained are they? Are they audited properly? In the UK, we've had a number of bankruptcies of large infrastructure organisations, which has affected millions of jobs and has raised questions about who was looking at the financial performance of these organisations. Were there boards of directors taking the appropriate action? Were auditors asking the right questions? So there's quite a high focus on the governance of business and organisations. And that's also linked into governance of major social corporations like Google and Facebook, and whether they act around misinformation. So there's been a lot of misinformation around vaccines and mask wearing and other issues. And there has been concern that those big social organizations responsible for billions of people accessing social media have not acted against information which is incorrect. And there was a lot of misinformation and fake news going around in the Brexit debate around whether the UK should leave the European Union. And again, real questions about transparency and accuracy of information. So all of those things have been playing into this new style of reporting. So I'm just going to look at a few different types of reports and highlight some of the things I thought were interesting about them. I'm going to start with Hilton Group, who won an award for their ESG report in 2020 and talked about travel with purpose. So their focus is on the travel and hospitality industry. The report's got a really good use of graphics, and there's a real attempt to link ESG issues that are relevant to their business with those that are relevant to their stakeholders. So we're talking about engaging our stakeholders and looking at what is fit for our business. They've identified some current goals and some 2030 goals, some longer term pieces of work. They're using some external global accreditation schemes. So it's not just them saying they're making progress, there is someone else looking at it. And they're identifying how far they've got on that progress. Another organisation I'd highlight is the Lloyds Banking Group, UK, but also with an international presence. And they've used, again, external validation by bringing in Deloitte to look at the accuracy of the impact statements they're making. They're doing some benchmarking around standards and awards. They're talking about the purpose of business and responsible business. And they've pulled together specific action plans for certain ESG areas, such as having an action plan for race. And they're plotting their progress. McDonald's is another organisation which has quite a lot of information about impact strategy and its ESG reporting. It's not done a report as such, but is creating a whole web area on their website where they talk about this type of activity. They're linking it to national and international standards. And in their case, they've decided to link some of their progress into progress against UN goals, which is quite an interesting approach I haven't seen elsewhere. PepsiCo have very much focused on the sustainability element, so very much the environmental and a bit of the people bit of ESG. But again, they've looked at sustainability in the context of their business. So they've talked about agriculture, water use, packaging, product development, climate change, and how that affects the people that they employ and their suppliers. They've identified some goals, and again, they're reflecting their progress against them. And they've got some really good graphics in their reporting to sort of show how they're approaching it. So that's quite a nice example of communicating this sort of information to wider audiences. JPMorgan Chase in the banking and consultancy sector do a much more traditional type report. It uses a reporting standards framework, but again, they very much looked at ESG and said, what are the relevant topics to our business and to our stakeholders? They've started to engage their stakeholders in the process. So a lot of these organizations are actively engaging stakeholders in how they make progress around these issues. And they've used, they quite interestingly use the term social capital, which is back to our integrated reporting, and particularly talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then they've focused on the sustainability measures that are relevant for their business, such as water, energy, fleet and office emissions, and paper use. And the last report I was going to highlight for you comes from Dow Chemicals. It's on their website. Again, it's an interactive web area, a bit like McDonald's have used. They've broken their performance into 6 key areas. And there's some really nice use of infographics on this website. and progress tracking against commitments made, so you can see what their commitment is and how far they've got towards it. And then they've also used some storytelling to take specific aspects and look at the impact and called them impact stories. So that's quite an interesting approach of facts, figures, but also the hearts and minds piece. But the thing I wanted to also just draw your attention to is interesting who is out there in this space of ESG reporting. I mean, there were lots of organizations undertaking these reports, but it's interesting that these ones were ones that came up highlighted. And because with the exception of Hilton, they don't all have a great track record. So either it is a suggestion that these organizations are addressing the problems they've had in the past and are making a real meaningful step change in the way they report, or it could be raising some real ethical issues, which I'm just going to go on to. So the issues for us as PR practitioners, I think there are 4 key areas we need to think about when we're giving strategic PR advice. So there is the ethical dimension. We in CIPR ask our PR professionals to sign up to a code of practice, which is around honesty and truth. So we need to be confident that when we're doing these reports, that we as PR professionals, when we create the reports, when we publish them, when we create the infographics, that the data we are being given is accurate and that our organisations really are committed to change. And when we've seen organisations get caught with this, so for instance, in the Black Lives Matter movement, a number of chief executives of major corporates decided to go out on Twitter and other platforms and talk about how they, as an organisation, were tackling racism. And that was great when it was genuinely meant and they had got a track record of doing that kind of work. But there were plenty who went out, probably against the advice of their PR professionals, and went out and spoke and were then caught because they had whistleblowers in the past who'd challenged them around racist practices in their organisations, and they hadn't actually done anything. So we need to be quite careful we are not sort of creating what's called social wash, that we are washing away and trying to cover up social issues for our organisations. Equally, there are lots of organisations who have very difficult track records on the environment. And it was interesting that Dow were in there because you may recall that they bought Union Carbide, who were responsible for the Bhopal incident in India, which is still affecting those communities almost 40 years on. ExxonMobil, and there are many industries and organisations that we may work with in the nuclear industry, in energy production, in mining and in chemicals and in manufacturing, who don't have great environmental records. So before we go out and talk about the great improvements our organisation is making around pollution, around water use, around sustainability, we as PR professionals need to be confident that there is real change and that we are not going to be accused of greenwashing our organisation, making it look better than it is. And we need to think about, has the governance really changed? If we've had problems where whistleblowers have not been listened to, or financial performance has been identified as not as good as we've said, we need to make sure that those structures have actually changed so that we can ethically say that our organisation is making improvements. And that links to trust and reputation. The relationship of government and business with its stakeholders and publics is all bound up in trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer looks at institutions globally, and it was quite interesting that in 2021, they found a fall in government trust, probably around COVID-related issues, and that business was the most trusted organisation in 18 out of 27 countries. So business was seen as both ethical and competent, and creating really good corporate and sustainability reports is part of that building of trust. Using external certification schemes, whether they're in-country standard or whether they're international standards, helps give validity to the claims one is making. And we need just make sure that we are really embedding this environmental, social and governance change in our organisations. There's a little bit about accessibility of information. How do we make sure that these reports are really accessible to the stakeholders who want to and should interrogate them? So that's making sure that perhaps we have interactive web formats as well as traditional copy reports, that we have dashboards and infographics that allow people to see at a glance the improvements and performance we're making, that we can use data in different ways. So perhaps use mapping of interactive data to show historical activity against current activity. And we also can think about new and innovative formats, such as storytelling through videos or podcasts or possibly webinars with our stakeholders. And finally, we need, as PR professionals, to remember to revisit our corporate PR strategy. Are our messages aligned with this new approach on corporate reporting and ESG? Is our public affairs messaging all aligned? So we're seeing that emerging with, for instance, luxury fashion brands who are, instead of emphasizing the seasons of fashion, are talking about the longevity of an item, the timelessness of that piece of jewelry, and that the value is worth having. It's worth paying more to have something that will last longer, rather than appealing to that kind of fast fashion, fast turnover. So we are seeing those changes. That was all I wanted to say. I'm open to questions. You can find me on social media at Mandy Pearse, and obviously there's also at CIPR Global. It's been lovely to be with you today.